The advertisement promised a new life under the vast Arizona sky. For Amelia Vance, fleeing the suffocating shadows of Boston society, it was a lifeline thrown into a sea of disgrace. The man who answered her letter, Kane, wrote very little. His words were like chips of granite, hard and sparse. He owned a ranch. He needed a wife. But as the train carried her deeper into a world of scorched earth and brutal sun, a familiar, secret pain began to throb deep within her belly. It was an ache no doctor in the city could name, a ghost of a mistake she thought she'd left 1,000 miles behind. She was traveling to marry a stranger, but the most terrifying stranger was the truth she carried inside her own body, a truth she would soon have no choice but to confess. The final jolt of the train felt less like an arrival and more like a verdict. Amelia Vance pressed her face against the grimy glass, the fine Boston broadcloth of her traveling suit feeling absurdly out of place. Outside the town of Redemption Gap wasn't a town so much as a suggestion, a handful of weathered buildings clinging to the scorched earth as if in defiance of the sun's relentless assault. Dust, the color of rust and regret, coated everything, the unpainted storefronts, the lethargic mule tied to a hitching post, and within moments of stepping onto the platform, Amelia's own tongue. She clutched her single scuffed valise, its leather handle worn smooth by her nervous grip. Inside were the meager remnants of her former life, a few dresses, a book of poetry by Mr. Browning, and the carefully folded letter from the man she was to marry. Kane. The name itself was a stark pronouncement. It held no softness, no hint of the comfortable domesticity she had once naively craved. His handwriting was brutally functional, each letter a straight, unadorned line. I have a ranch, 200 acres, need a helpmate. I am a quiet man. Send a photograph. I will send the train fare. She had sent the photograph, a stiff, formal portrait, taken before the scandal, before her world had collapsed into whispers and sideways glances. She had tried to look respectable, capable. She had not smiled. Now, standing on that platform, under the immense, indifferent blue of the Arizona sky, she wondered what he had seen in the face of that pale, haunted woman. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the station's overhang. He was taller than she had imagined, with a breadth of shoulder that spoke of a life of physical labor. He moved with a liquid grace that was at odds with his size, his worn boots making almost no sound on the warped planks. His skin was the color of burnished copper, weathered by sun and wind, and his hair, black as a raven's wing, was tied back at the nape of his neck with a simple leather thong. But it was his eyes that seized her. They were a startling, pale gray, the color of a winter storm, and they watched her with an unnerving stillness. He did not smile. He did not offer a greeting. He simply stood there, assessing her. Amelia Vance. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It wasn't unkind, but it held no welcome. Yes, she managed her own voice, a thin, reedy thing. Mr. Kane. He gave a single curt nod. The name's just Kane. He took the valise from her hand, his calloused fingers brushing hers. The touch was like a spark of lightning, impersonal, yet charged with a raw, untamed energy. He turned without another word and strode toward a battered buckboard wagon hitched to a pair of sturdy-looking horses. The silence on the ride out of town was a physical presence. It pressed in on Amelia, magnifying the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic plod of the horses' hooves. She had prepared speeches in her mind, polite inquiries about his land, his work, the local community. But the man beside her was a fortress of silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his jaw set in a line as unyielding as the distant mesas. She stole glances at him. He was not a handsome man, in the way the gentlemen of Boston were handsome. There were no soft edges to him, no cultivated charm. His face was a map of a hard life, with lines etched around his eyes, and a faint white scar that traced a path from his temple into his hairline. There was a profound loneliness about him, an isolation so complete it seemed to have become a part of his very skin. And in that, she felt a terrifying flicker of kinship. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was even more desolate than she had feared. A small, sturdy cabin, made of sun-baked adobe and dark timber, stood in the center of a clearing, looking small and vulnerable against the vast, empty landscape. A corral held a few horses, and a small barn leaned, as if tired of standing. There were no trees to soften the view, no garden, no sign of a woman's touch. There was only the cabin, the barn, and the endless, aching expanse of rock and dust under the vast, watchful sky. Kane pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down. "This is it," he said, the words hanging in the dry air. He carried her valise inside. The interior was Spartan and shockingly clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the single room. A bed neatly made with a simple wool blanket was tucked into a corner. Another smaller cot was on the opposite side. A few iron pots hung by the hearth, and a shelf held a few tins of supplies. It was the home of a man who needed nothing more than basic shelter. "The cot is yours," he said, placing her valise beside it. He gestured toward a water pump outside the door. "Water is from the well. It's good water." He then pointed to a small enclosed area at the back of the cabin. The kitchen. Amelia stood in the middle of the room, her fine dress a mockery of her surroundings. This was her new life. This silent man, this empty cabin, this crushing, overwhelming loneliness. The dull ache in her lower abdomen, which had been a quiet companion on the train, pulsed with a sudden sharp intensity. She pressed a hand against it, a familiar gesture of secret shame. Kane noticed the movement. His stormy grey eyes flickered down to her hand, then back to her face. For a fleeting second, she saw something in his expression, not pity, but a kind of weary recognition. "Supper is at sundown," he said, his voice flat, betraying nothing. He turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving her alone with the silence and the 4 walls that were now her world. As the door closed, Amelia sank onto the cot, the rough blanket scratching against her cheek, and for the first time since leaving Boston, she allowed a single hot tear to trace a clean path through the dust on her skin. The first week was an exercise in silence, a carefully choreographed dance of 2 people occupying the same small space while pretending the other didn't exist. Days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. Kane rose before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards her only alarm clock. He would be gone for hours tending to his horses, mending fences at the far edges of his property, his solitary figure a mere speck in the vast landscape. Amelia, in turn, dedicated herself to the cabin. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, aired out the blankets until they smelled of sun and sage, and attempted to bring a semblance of order to the meager kitchen. She learned the quirks of the wood-burning stove, the way the well water was shockingly cold even at midday, and the fine art of making biscuits from flour, lard, and water. These tasks became her armor. As long as her hands were busy, her mind couldn't dwell on the colossal mistake she had made. Their interactions were limited to brusque necessities. "The flour is low. I'll go to town on Saturday." The grey mare threw a shoe. "Is she lame?" Number meals were the most agonizing part of the day. They would sit at the small table, the space between them, a chasm of unspoken words. The only sounds were the scrape of forks against tin plates and the crackle of the fire. Amelia would watch him eat his movements, economical and precise. He ate like a man who had known true hunger, wasting nothing. He never complimented her cooking, but he always cleaned his plate. For this small, wordless acknowledgement, she was pathetically grateful. The ache inside her was a constant, unwelcome guest. Some days it was a dull, throbbing pressure. On others it was a sharp, stabbing pain that made her gasp and clutch her side. She hid it from him, turning away to press her fists into her abdomen, when a spasm hit her face, a mask of strained neutrality. She feared the pain, but she feared him discovering it even more. It was her secret, her shame, the physical manifestation of her ruin. To reveal it would be to unravel the whole sordid story. She had crossed a continent to escape. One afternoon, a sudden violent cramp seized her as she was hauling a bucket of water from the well. The bucket slipped from her grasp, sloshing water over her boots and the thirsty ground. She doubled over, a strangled cry escaping her lips. He was there in an instant. She hadn't even heard him approach. One moment she was alone, the next. His shadow fell over her. He didn't speak, but simply took her by the elbow, his grip firm but not harsh, and guided her back into the cabin. He sat her down on her cot, his expression unreadable. "Are you unwell?" he asked, his voice low and even. "It's nothing," she lied, her face, pale beads of sweat on her brow. "Just a woman's complaint. It will pass." He looked at her for a long moment, his grey eyes seeming to see right through her carefully constructed facade. He saw the lie, she was sure of it. He saw the fear and the pain she tried so desperately to conceal. She braced herself for an accusation, for a demand for the truth, for the disgust she had seen in her own father's eyes. Instead, he turned away and went to the hearth. He poured a cup of water from the kettle he kept warm and brought it to her. "Rest," he said. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a quiet command. He picked up the empty bucket and went back outside to refill it. From that day on, a subtle shift occurred. The silence between them remained, but it was no longer hostile. It became a shared space, a territory they navigated with a new, unspoken understanding. He started leaving a full bucket of water just inside the door each morning. When he returned from town on Saturday, among the flour and beans was a small paper-wrapped package of horehound candy, the kind meant to soothe a sore throat. He placed it on the table without a word and left the cabin. Amelia found herself watching him more closely. She saw the way he gentled a skittish foal, his deep voice, a soothing murmur. She saw the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders after a long day under the relentless sun. She saw him one evening, standing at the edge of the corral, staring out at the blood-red sunset, his face a mask of such profound and bottomless loneliness that it stole her breath. He was a man drowning in silence, and she, in her own way, was drowning right alongside him. She began to see that his quietness wasn't a rejection of her, but a part of his nature. Words for him were not tools for casual connection. They were reserved for things of absolute necessity. He lived a life of action, of substance, where a mended fence held more value than an empty pleasantry. Her pain, however, didn't recede. It grew more insistent, a constant reminder of Boston, of opulent drawing rooms, of whispered promises from a man named Sterling Croft, and of the dark, terrifying night in a back alley room with a woman whose hand smelled of whiskey and carbolic acid. The ache was the price she was paying, a debt that seemed to grow with each passing day. She knew she couldn't hide it forever. The charade of the capable helpmate was becoming impossible to maintain. She was a broken thing, a piece of damaged goods sold under false pretenses. Soon he would discover the truth of his bad bargain. And then she thought, with a cold knot of dread in her stomach, this fragile, silent peace would shatter, and she would be truly and utterly alone. The breaking point arrived on a moonless, star-strewn night. A chill had descended from the high desert, and the wind, a mournful, keening thing, rattled the cabin's single window pane. Amelia had been fighting the pain all day, a searing, twisting agony that felt like a hot knife in her womb. She had managed to prepare a simple stew for their supper, moving with a stiff, deliberate slowness, her jaw clenched to keep from crying out. They ate in their usual silence, but tonight it felt different. It was charged heavy with her unspoken torment. Cain watched her across the table, his grey eyes missing nothing, the unnatural pallor of her skin, the slight tremor in her hands as she lifted her spoon, the way she barely touched her food. After the meal, as he was banking the fire for the night, a wave of pain so intense crashed over her that the world went grey at the edges. A low moan escaped her throat before she could stifle it. She pressed both hands to her lower belly, curling in on herself at the table. Cain was beside her instantly, his movements silent and swift. He placed a hand on her shoulder. His touch was hesitant, as if he were handling something impossibly fragile. Amelia, he said her name, a rough sound in the quiet room. It was one of the few times he had used it. What is it, tell me? The dam of her composure, so painstakingly built and maintained, finally broke. The pain, the shame, the loneliness, the terror, it all came pouring out in a torrent of gasping sobs. The tears she had held back for months streamed down her face, hot and bitter. I can't. She wept, her voice muffled against her arms. You'll send me away. Everyone would. He didn't move. His hand remained on her shoulder, a steady grounding weight. He didn't speak, didn't press her, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just waited, his silence an invitation. He had offered her water when she stumbled, candy when she was unwell. He had given her rest. Now he was giving her this, a space to speak her truth, no matter how ugly. Taking a shuddering breath, she lifted her head. In the flickering firelight, his face was all sharp angles and deep shadows, his eyes holding an unwavering, patient focus. She looked into them and saw not a judge, but a fellow solitary soul. And so the words began to spill out, haltingly at first, then, with a desperate, unstoppable rush. It's an ache, she began, her voice a raw whisper. Down there. I've been aching down there for almost a year. She told him everything. She spoke of Boston, of her father's failing business, and her mother's social ambitions. She spoke of Sterling Croft, a man with a charming smile, and hands that were never still, a man who had promised her marriage, and a future who had whispered poetry to her in stolen moments in the conservatory. He was wealthy, powerful. My parents encouraged the match. I was a fool. I believed him. I thought I was in love. Her voice broke on a self-mocking laugh. I gave him what he wanted. What he told me, a woman gives the man she is to marry. Cain's expression didn't change. He just listened, his gaze never leaving her face. He was as still as the mesas on the horizon, a silent, unmovable witness to her unburdening. And then, she choked on the word I found. I was with child. I was terrified, but also hopeful. I thought now he would have to marry me. Now my parents would be safe. When I told him, he laughed. He called me a naive little fool. He was already betrothed to a woman from a family far wealthier than mine. He said I was a liability, a complication to be dealt with. She had to pause, pressing her knuckles to her lips to stifle another sob. The wind howled outside, a fitting chorus to her tale of woe. He gave me money. He gave me an address in a part of the city I had never been. He told me to go there and fix my problem. He said if I ever spoke his name, he would ruin what was left of my family's reputation completely. The cabin was so quiet, Amelia could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. Kane's hand was still on her shoulder, a silent anchor in the storm of her memory. The woman, she wasn't a doctor. Her house smelled of rot and gin. Her hands were not clean. Amelia's voice dropped so low it was barely audible. She hurt me. There was so much pain, so much blood. I thought I was going to die on her filthy table. When it was over, she told me the problem was fixed and pushed me out into the street. The baby was gone. And ever since that night, this ache, it has never left me. Some days are better, but it's always there. A reminder, a punishment. She finally finished her confession, hanging in the air between them, raw and shameful. She had laid the ugliest, most secret part of herself at his feet. She was not the respectable widow her advertisement had hinted at. She was a ruined woman, damaged goods, carrying the physical and emotional scars of her disgrace. She waited for the recoil, the flicker of disgust in his eyes, the cold, hard words that would tell her to pack her things. Kane was silent for a long time. The fire popped and hissed, and the wind whispered at the door. He slowly removed his hand from her shoulder. Amelia's heart sank. This was it. He stood up, walked over to the hearth, and added another log to the fire, coaxing the flames back to life. Then he turned back to her. His face, illuminated by the fresh blaze, was etched with a deep, sorrowful gravity. He walked not to the door, but to the shelf where they kept their supplies. He took down a tin cup and a small leather pouch she had never seen before. He spooned some dried leaves from the pouch into the cup, poured hot water from the kettle over them, and brought the steaming cup to her. "Willow bark," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the still room. "It will help with the pain." He placed the cup in her trembling hands. His fingers brushed hers, and this time the touch was not a shock, but a strange and unexpected comfort. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his next words were not a judgment, not a dismissal, but a simple statement of fact that would forever change the landscape of their lives. "You will not be sent away." And with that, he went to his own bed on the other side of the room, lay down and turned his back to her, granting her the privacy to drink her tea and absorb the monumental weight of what had just passed between them. The lonely Apache had just listened, and in his listening, he had offered her something she hadn't realized. She was starving for a sliver of grace in a world that had shown her none. The confession did not magically erase the silence between them, but it transformed its nature. The tension that had defined their coexistence dissolved, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. It was as if, by naming her deepest wound, Amelia had given Kane a map to the broken geography of her soul, and he in turn chose to walk its terrain with a quiet, unexpected care. He began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in small offerings of words. He would point to a distant hawk circling in the sky and say, "Red tail, good hunter," or he would hand her a strangely shaped root he'd dug up. "Yarrow, good for fevers." He was teaching her in his own spare way the language of this land, a language of survival and resilience. The willow bark tea became a nightly ritual. He would prepare it for her without being asked, the simple act, a constant, gentle reassurance of his words. "You will not be sent away." The tea didn't erase the pain, but it dulled its sharpest edges, allowing her to sleep more deeply than she had in months. One afternoon, Kane rode out and returned not with supplies from Redemption Gap, but with a visitor. She was an older woman, her face a beautiful network of wrinkles, her silver-white hair in 2 long braids. Her name was Martha, a widow who lived a few miles down the canyon, a woman who straddled the worlds of the settlers and the native tribes trusted by both. Martha knows herbs was Kane's only explanation. Amelia was initially terrified, the memory of the woman in Boston a fresh terror. But Martha's hands were clean and her eyes were kind. She asked Amelia gentle questions, her voice soft and soothing. She examined her not with clinical detachment, but with a woman's empathy. She prescribed new teas, poultices of comfrey and calendula, and gave Amelia simple instructions for exercises to ease the cramping. "The body remembers its hurts," Martha said, patting Amelia's hand. "Sometimes the soul must teach it to heal." This man, she nodded toward Kane, who stood stoically by the door. He understands such things. As Martha left, Amelia turned to Kane, her heart full of a strange and overwhelming emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "A ranch needs 2 strong hands," he said, his practical words a shield for the deeper kindness of the act. In the weeks that followed, as Amelia's physical health slowly began to improve under Martha's care, their alliance deepened. She began to ask him questions about his own life, and to her surprise, he began to answer. He told her of his father, a white trapper who had disappeared back east when he was a boy, and of his mother, a woman of the people who had taught him the ways of the desert before she was taken by a fever. "I do not belong fully to her world," he said one evening as they sat outside, watching the stars prick the velvet darkness. "My face is hers, but my eyes are his. The white men in town see my mother. The people see my father." For the first time, Amelia understood the true depth of his solitude. It wasn't just a preference for quiet. It was a state of being imposed upon him by a world that had no place for a man who lived between 2 shores. He was as much an outcast as she was, his scars simply on the outside for all to see. Their partnership extended to the work of the ranch. She insisted on helping, and he began to teach her. He showed her how to groom the horses, her initial fear giving way to a fondness for the animal's warm, solid presence. He taught her how to mend a leather strap, how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to find her way by the stars. She, in turn, brought a softness to his stark existence. She planted a small garden by the cabin door, coaxing stubborn greens and bright red chilies from the dry soil. She repaired the torn pages of his one book, a worn copy of Shakespeare with careful stitches. One evening he came into the cabin to find her humming softly to herself as she kneaded dough for the next day's bread. He stopped in the doorway and simply watched her for a moment, a look on his face she had never seen before, something less guarded, something that might almost have been contentment. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was becoming a home. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with a comfortable understanding. They were 2 broken people, washed up on the shore of a harsh and unforgiving land, who were slowly, tentatively learning how to mend each other. Amelia's past, however, was not a ghost that could be so easily exorcised. It was a debt, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that someday the collector would come calling. She just prayed that when he did, the fragile peace she had found in this desolate corner of the world would be strong enough to withstand the storm. The railroad was coming. The news buzzed through Redemption Gap like a swarm of angry locusts, bringing with it a fever of speculation and a parade of new faces. Surveyors, speculators, and businessmen descended on the small town, their eastern suits and polished boots, a stark contrast to the dusty, work-worn attire of the locals. They spoke of progress and prosperity, but Kane saw only the threat of fences' deeds and the carving up of the open land he considered his birthright. He and Amelia were in town for supplies when she saw him. Her back was to the main street as she haggled with the dry goods proprietor, Mr. Henderson, over the price of coffee beans. Kane was outside, loading sacks of grain onto the buckboard. A train had arrived that morning, and the saloon was spilling over with loud, boisterous men. Then she heard a voice, a smooth, cultured baritone that cut through the noise of the street and pierced her like a shard of ice. "My good man, I assure you, the Arizona Land and Mineral Company is prepared to make a most generous offer for these territories." Amelia froze her hand, hovering over a barrel of pickles. That voice. It was a voice from her nightmares, a voice that had whispered promises in the dark and then condemned her with a laugh. She turned slowly, a dreadful certainty coiling in her gut. There, standing in the middle of the street, as if he owned it, was Sterling Croft. He was older, a bit thicker around the middle but unmistakable. He wore an expensive tailored suit of charcoal grey, a pearl pin in his cravat, and the same insufferably confident smile. He was flanked by two other men, listening with rapt attention as he gestured expansively at the surrounding hills. The world tilted on its axis. Amelia felt the air rush from her lungs. The store, the town, the entire Arizona territory seemed to shrink until it contained only her and the architect of her ruin. He hadn't seen her yet. She ducked back behind a stack of crates, her heart hammering against her ribs. What was he doing here? Of all the desolate, forgotten places in the world, why here it had to be the railroad. His company, the one he had mentioned, was surely tied to it. He was here to devour this land just as he had devoured her innocence. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She had to get away. She had to get back to the ranch, to the safety of its adobe walls and the silent strength of the man who lived within them. She fumbled in her reticule, threw a handful of coins onto the counter without counting them, and mumbled a hasty goodbye to a bewildered Mr. Henderson. She hurried out of the store, keeping her head down her bonnet, shielding her face. She practically ran to the buckboard, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Kane looked up from his work, his brow furrowed at her obvious distress. "What is it?" he asked, his grey eyes scanning the street. "We have to go." Now she urged, her voice trembling as she climbed onto the wagon seat. Before he could question her further, Croft's voice boomed again, closer this time. "Progress is an unstoppable force, gentlemen. It sweeps away the old to make way for the new." He and his associates had begun to walk down the street directly toward them. There was no escape. Kane saw the direction of her terrified gaze and followed it. He saw the well-dressed man the source of her panic. His body went rigid, a subtle tensing of muscle that was more menacing than any overt threat. Croft's eyes swept carelessly over the buckboard, the horses, the silent man with the copper skin, and then finally they landed on Amelia. For a moment, there was a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, then a slow, cruel smile of recognition spread across his face. He stopped his associates, halting beside him. "Well, I'll be Sterling Croft," said his voice, dripping with condescending amusement. "Amelia Vance, of all the God-forsaken holes to find a flower of Boston society. What a remarkable coincidence." Amelia felt pinned by his gaze, all the old shame and fear rising up to choke her. She could feel Kane's stillness beside her, a coiled spring of dangerous energy. Croft's eyes raked over her worn calico dress, then flickered to Kane, a dismissive, contemptuous look on his face. "I see you've adapted to your new environment and found some local color to keep you company." The insult, casual and brutal, hung in the air. Kane's hand, which had been resting on the wagon seat, clenched into a fist. He didn't speak, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. Amelia found her voice a thin, wavering thread of sound. "Leave us alone, Sterling." Croft chuckled a low, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I have no intention of bothering you, my dear. I'm a busy man. Building empires, you understand. It's just amusing to see how far you've fallen. Tell me, do you still suffer from those delicate complaints of yours?" The veiled reference to her condition, spoken with such casual cruelty in the middle of a public street, was like a slap in the face. Humiliation, hot and searing, washed over her. She saw one of Croft's associates snicker behind his hand. This was her past, risen from the grave. It hadn't just returned. It had marched into her sanctuary with all the arrogance and power she had fled, threatening to burn down the fragile life she had so painstakingly built. And as she looked from Croft's smug, triumphant face to the cold, murderous fury gathering in Kane's storm-grey eyes, she knew the confrontation she had dreaded for so long was no longer a possibility, but an inevitability. The ride back to the ranch was a long, suffocating silence. The air in the buckboard was thick with unspoken fury and dread. Amelia sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, replaying Croft's mocking words, the sneer on his face, the casual cruelty of his public humiliation. Beside her, Kane was a statue, carved from granite and rage. His hands on the reins were steady, but the line of his jaw was hard, and his eyes, fixed on the trail ahead, held a dangerous, simmering light. When they reached the cabin, he brought the horses to a halt, but made no move to get down. He turned to her, his voice low and taut. "That was the man. It wasn't a question." Amelia nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes. He is the reason for your pain." "Yes," she whispered. Kane stared at the distant mesas for a long moment, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunched tight. "Men like him," he said, his voice a low growl, "believe the world is theirs to take. They believe people are theirs to use and discard. They leave scars on the land and on the soul." He finally looked at her, his eyes blazing. "This is my land. You are under my roof. He will not bring his poison here." His declaration, fierce and possessive, sent a shiver through her. It wasn't the threatening ownership of a man like Croft, but the raw protective instinct of a man defending his territory, and she had somehow become part of that territory. The next few days were fraught with tension. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Kane took to carrying his rifle with him. Everywhere, his quiet vigilance, a constant, unnerving presence. The confrontation came, as Amelia knew, it would not with a quiet threat, but with the full force of Croft's arrogance. He didn't come alone. He rode up to the ranch one afternoon with the two associates she had seen in town, and the town sheriff, a paunchy, sweating man named Blevins, who clearly owed his allegiance to the deepest pockets. Kane met them in the yard, standing before the cabin door, as if he were an extension of the earth itself. Amelia watched from the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Kane, is it?" Croft called out, his tone offensively familiar. He remained mounted on his fine black stallion, looking down on the man on the ground. "I'm Sterling Croft with the Arizona Land and Mineral Company. We're buying up territory for the railroad. I'm here to make you a generous offer for this worthless piece of rock you call a ranch." "It is not for sale," Kane said, his voice flat and final. Croft smiled, a predator's smile. "Everything is for sale, my good man." "Perhaps you don't understand. This isn't a negotiation. The railroad is coming through. Your deed to this land is questionable from what I gather. A man of your heritage often finds legal matters complicated. It would be much simpler for you to take my money and move on." "I am not moving on," Kane stated, his feet planted firmly. Croft's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed. "I see. Perhaps there's another matter to discuss then. The woman, Amelia. She's in there, isn't she?" He swung down from his horse, his boots crunching on the dry ground. "Sheriff, I have reason to believe this man is holding a respectable Boston lady here against her will. She is clearly unwell, perhaps mentally unstable, and has fallen under his influence." Sheriff Blevins shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Mr. Croft, I am her former fiancé." Croft lied smoothly, his voice ringing with false concern. "Her protector. I've come to take her back to civilization, where she can receive the proper care she needs." He took a step toward the cabin. "Amelia, come out here. You don't have to be afraid of this savage any longer." The word hung in the air, a deliberate, venomous dart. Kane's hand twitched, but he remained still. At that moment, the cabin door opened. Amelia stepped out, her face pale, but her back ramrod straight. She had been hiding for too long. She walked to Kane's side, standing with him before him, a united front. She looked directly at Sterling Croft, her voice clear and steady, devoid of the fear he expected. "I am here of my own free will, Sterling. This is my home." Croft's face contorted with rage. His carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. "You see, Sheriff, she's delirious. He has her bewitched." He turned his fury on Amelia. "After all I did for you, I saved you from ruin, from disgrace. And this is how you repay me, by shacking up with a half-breed in the middle of nowhere. You ungrateful little slattern." The ugly words, the truth of his contempt for her, were finally out in the open. But instead of withering under them, Amelia felt a strange sense of liberation. The spell of his power over her was broken. "You saved no one," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "You used me. You abandoned me. You paid to have a part of me carved out and thrown away like garbage, and you left me to bleed. The pain you caused me is not in my mind, Sterling. It is in my body. It is a scar you left, and I will carry it forever. But I will not carry your shame. Not any more." She looked at the sheriff. "This man is the savage sheriff, not the one standing beside me. The man beside me gave me shelter when I had none. He gave me kindness when all I had known was cruelty. He listened when the whole world shut its ears." Croft, incandescent with fury at being so thoroughly exposed, lunged for her. "You little liar, he never reached her." In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Kane stepped between them. He didn't draw his rifle. He didn't even raise his fists. He simply caught Croft's arm in a grip of iron, stopping him dead. "You will not touch her," Kane said, his voice a low, lethal whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "You will get on your horse. You will leave my land. And if you ever speak her name again, the railroad will have to find a new path, because this canyon will be your grave." The raw, primal threat delivered with such chilling calm finally broke through Croft's arrogance. He saw something in Kane's storm-grey eyes, that he understood a complete and utter absence of fear, and a capacity for violence that his money and influence could not protect him from. He wrenched his arm free, his face a mask of hate and humiliation. He stumbled back to his horse, hauling himself into the saddle. He glared at Amelia, and Kane, a silent promise of retribution in his eyes. "This isn't over," he spat, before wheeling his horse around and riding away his associates, and a visibly shaken Sheriff Blevins trailing in his dusty wake. Amelia stood in the sudden ringing silence, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. She had faced her demon and had not flinched. She had spoken her truth. She looked at Cain, the man who had stood with her for her. He was watching the dust settle on the trail, his posture still rigid, still ready for a fight. When he finally turned to her, the fury in his eyes had softened into something else, something deep and unreadable. He had not only defended his home, he had defended her honor, validating her past and her pain in a way no one ever had. The chasm between them, once a vast expanse of silence and sorrow, was finally irrevocably bridged. Sterling Croft was a man accustomed to winning, but he had underestimated the quiet resilience of the desert and its people. His public humiliation at the ranch became the talk of redemption gap. Amelia's clear-voiced defense and Cain's chilling threat, recounted with considerable embellishment by Sheriff Blevins, painted Croft not as a concerned benefactor, but as an arrogant bully. The people of the territory were wary of outsiders, especially those who came with the railroad, and they instinctively sided with one of their own, even an outsider like Cain. Croft's power, built on influence and money, proved useless against the stubborn code of the West. Finding the town suddenly cold and the prospect of dealing with Cain again distinctly unappealing, he and his company moved on, seeking easier conquests further down the line. His departure did not bring celebration to the small adobe cabin. There was no grand victory, only a quiet, profound relief. The storm had passed, leaving a stillness in its wake, but the landscape was forever changed. The confrontation had shattered the last of Amelia's illusions about her past. It had forced her to vocalize her trauma, not as a whispered, shameful secret, but as a clear-throated accusation. In doing so, she had reclaimed a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. The ache in her belly remained a physical echo of the wound she would always carry. Martha's herbs and her own growing strength made it more manageable, but she now understood it was a part of her story, a scar no different than the one on Cain's temple. The dynamic between them shifted once more, settling into a new, deeper rhythm. The silence that returned was not one of awkwardness or unspoken pain, but of shared peace. They worked side by side, mending the fences Croft's ambition had threatened their movements, synchronized their understanding, implicit. One evening, weeks after Croft had gone, they were sitting outside the cabin, watching the sky bleed from orange to purple. The air was cool and smelled of dust and creosote. "He will not be the last," Cain said, his voice a low murmur. "More will come. The railroad will bring them. They will want the water and the land." "I know," Amelia replied softly. She looked at his strong, weathered profile against the fading light. "But we will face them." She had used the word "we" without thinking, and its significance hung in the air between them. We. It was a word that staked a claim, a word that bound their two solitary lives together. He turned to look at her, his pale grey eyes holding an emotion she was finally beginning to understand. It wasn't pity or passion in the way the poets wrote of it. It was something quieter, stronger. It was respect. It was recognition. Yes, he said the single word, a vow. "We will." He reached out not to touch her face or her hand, but to gently trace the worn seam on the sleeve of her dress. It was a gesture of immense tenderness, an acknowledgement of the simple domestic life they were building together, stitch by stitch. Life on the ranch continued. Days were filled with hard work, and nights were filled with a quiet companionship. He taught her the names of the constellations, and she read to him from her book of poems by the firelight. They never spoke the words love or marriage in the conventional sense. Their bond was forged of something more elemental, shared wounds, mutual respect, and the fierce unspoken promise to stand as a bulwark for one another against a world that had tried to break them both. The lonely Apache and the mail-order bride had each come to this place seeking an escape. What they found was something far more precious. They found a home in the heart of the wilderness and a sanctuary in the soul of another outcast. The ache had not vanished, but it no longer defined Amelia. It was simply a part of her history. And as she sat beside the quiet, steady man who had listened to her confession and stood with her against the storm, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the scars that remain are not a sign of weakness, but a testament to the strength it takes to survive. In the vast, often brutal theater of the American West, the loudest stories are of gunfights and gold rushes. But the truest stories are often the quietest ones, whispered in the lonely spaces between two people who have nowhere else to turn. Amelia and Cain's journey wasn't about conquering the frontier. It was about conquering the ghosts of their own pasts. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest act of healing isn't a grand gesture, but the simple, profound act of listening. Theirs is a story of how two broken souls discarded by the world could find in each other not a cure for their scars, but the strength to bear them together. If this story of unexpected kindness and fierce resilience in the untold West moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a story with real heart, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. We have so many more tales of the quiet corners and forgotten voices of history to share with you. Thank you for listening.